la continuación de la Cátedra Gaos, que imparte Manuel Vargas de la Universidad de San Diego, en California, y hoy será la cuarta conferencia titulada The Project of a People, y después tendremos preguntas y respuestas.
All right. Well, thanks for showing up. I mean, you give some talks, you go away for a while, you give people an opportunity to think, boy, that was a disaster. I'm not coming back for any of the rest. So thank you. So I thought what I would do today is start with just a quick recap of what I said last time, and then we'll start with the story today. So the story thus far is the first lecture was about Mexico and the history of philosophy. And the issues there were partly about trying to think through the project, the aims and presumptions of doing a history of philosophy in Mexico and what that would involve. And then the question about whether or not we should extend our categories of what we think of as philosophy to work that was done in the pre-conquest era. And there I was inclined to say it doesn't, that it's not crazy to think of the work that some of the Mexica thinkers were doing might count as philosophy, but that it's an open question about how useful and interesting and that work is for our purposes today. Then the second lecture was on ignorance and atrocity. There I was just looking at the Las Casas Sepúlveda debate, and a central piece of that was partly what I was trying to convince you of was not just of its interestingness, but in particular the revisiting the way in which people have thought about what the Sepulvedan legacy was and what the position was. And so that was what that talk was about. Then we talked about Sor Juana, if Aristotle had cooked. This is a line from Sor Juana's Respuesta. And so there I wanted to talk about and read Sor Juana as a philosopher. That is, she's primarily read and understood as a poet, but for the purpose of this talk, I wanted to think about her work, understanding it as a kind of piece of philosophy. So there the focus was on the social construction of people's abilities, the way this intersected with gender, and then some attention to her social epistemology and the work in skeptical theology. So that gets us up to this set of lectures that I'm giving this week. So initially I had announced a different order, so the fourth and sixth lectures have gotten flipped, and so that's what we're going to be doing this time here. I think what was originally the sixth lecture is today the Project of a People. So here I'm going to be talking about race, culture, and projects. We'll talk about Vasconcelos, and then on Wednesday I'll be talking about accidentality and culturally structured agency, or as I sometimes think of it, an attempt to save la filosofía de lo mexicano from itself. And then the last set will be on, this small footnote, pronouncing this word is a terrible disaster. So there's this complicated reasons why it ends up in English pronounced as quixotic, and why that's in fact the proper English language pronunciation of the word, even though you'd think it would be quixotic or quixotic or quixotesco. Anyway, so anyway, the meditations. We'll be talking a bit about that. And there the focus is going to be on partly about thinking about, in fact, Don Quixote, but the legacy of philosophical reflection that grows out of that and its connection to interesting contemporary issues in philosophy. Okay, so first I want to start off with what I'm going to call here the selective cooperation problem. So here, for a moment, let's just stop thinking about the history of philosophy, stop thinking about the history of Mexican philosophy, and just think about the problem that large communities have about how you get cooperation up and running. And one of the important features about cooperation amongst large human groups is that we need cooperation selectively. So that is, you don't want to cooperate with just anybody. So people who take advantage of you, who exploit you, who violate expectations on a consistent basis in ways that are harmful to you, you don't want to do that. So we've got to be selective about who we cooperate with. And so there's a kind of question about how do we enforce cooperation and how do we get cooperation to be stable over time. And there's a bunch of standard responses that are given to this about how you scale up cooperation amongst groups of people. So one version of that just says we do it through force and threats. So this is the way in which I'm told some parents parent their children is through force and threats, right? So that is, if you don't insert whatever the thing is, then I will, and then insert force and or threat into the story. So that's one way we do it. And we do this kind of, this is a, you might think this is the basis of human civilization, was force and threats for a very long period of time. That's one way that people have sometimes tried to tell this story. It's actually an open question whether or not that's in fact how it happened. But that's a kind of standard, a very 19th century way to tell the story about how human sociality got going, is initially it's force and threats. This is, I think, the kind of story that Nietzsche, for example, tells in The Genealogy of Morality, that it was a history of lots of pain that got human beings to create creatures that could keep promises and to thereby enable social cooperation. And then a different way to do it is to leverage the fact of our selective sociality and the benefits that we get from having these kinds of pro-social attitudes that we have, where we want to enjoy other people's company, hang out with them, do things cooperatively with them. We have these pro-social attitudes, and one thing you can think is we can leverage some of that by having imagined or constructed or discovered binding principles. And the way this operates is oftentimes by the construction of things like laws and offices, right? So we say, look, around here we have a law that we're going to use, and that's a kind of construction, right? So we construct this thing about a local law. We're going to drive on this side of the street. We're going to fine you if you violate our expectations in the following sort of way. But it's not just laws that do it. Other kinds of imagined or constructed binding principles that we invoke can involve things like shared language, shared moral system, shared religion. But of course, the result of this is that you tend to fight this other kind of pressure, the pressures towards tribalisms that grow out of whatever it is that your unit of social cooperation is. So tribalism's about we are this given people, we are this nation state, people who are not members of that community, we can regard with suspicion, hostility, and so on. So this is the great big challenge. I think of this as the kind of the two challenges about human community. So on the one hand, the challenge of human community is how do you get binding up and running? On the other hand, how do you keep that binding from becoming corrosive in a way that produces a tribalism that is destructive in other kinds of ways? Standard question in political philosophy are about what kinds of alternatives do we have at the level of large-scale human organizations. So on the one side, we've got nationalisms, super motivationally effective, but really pernicious to outgroups, right? So if I can get everybody to be super nationalistic, that's great for everybody who's inside the nation, terrible for anybody who makes the mistake of stepping across the border. Right? And I'll let you think up examples where that might be true. On the flip side, there's cosmopolitanism, which folks like people in this room oftentimes, we're the folks that tend to be really excited about cosmopolitanism. It's super appealing to educated, affluent populations. We love the idea of being able to go to other places and feel at home in other parts of the world, to get the best goodies that there are from wherever they are. We can have our pan francés, and we can go and have our Thai noodles, and we can go and have our I'll have a slide of it later on, our Korean barbecue tacos. So cosmopolitanism is really exciting for us. But the problem with cosmopolitanism, of course, is it doesn't scale super well. Lots of folks who don't have the goodies that we have are very skeptical about cosmopolitanism, and they're going to care about their own communities in ways that make it hard to pull off cosmopolitanism. So here's the kind of basic worry that I think everybody who's thinking about political theory in the international domain has to wrestle with in some way, shape, or form. That is, are we stuck with ongoing clashes between ethno-national states, religiously ordered communities, and an always fragile cosmopolitanism? Right? So that's, I think, 21st century, 2019, look around the world today. You can sort an enormous number of states into one of these three kinds of states. That is, ethno-national states, religiously ordered communities, or fragile cosmopolitan states. And I say fragile because, of course, they depend on and rely on things like rule of law and a commitment to the openness of difference. And that, of course, as we've seen, is not always super stable. Okay, so in Anglophone political theory, your kind of basic versions of the stories that people tell about this kind of thing, on the one hand, you have sort of Rawlsian political liberalism. And then on the other side, you have various forms of communitarianism. That's Alistair McIntyre, who we'll talk more about in just a moment. And of course, there's lots of other stories to be told in there. But on one side, you can see what the basic pressures are. How do we bind, and how do we bind in ways that don't end up with robust partiality that ends up becoming corrosive? That's the kind of central question. All right, so here's one question to think about. So if we assume something like that is the kind of default story, the background story in international political theory right now, you might ask, well, what would it look like to think about modern, large-scale social binding problems if your nation was already multi-ethnic, multiracial, afraid of cultural destabilization, but not in the North Atlantic? And if that was your thought, then you might want to take a look at the work of a figure who was centrally concerned about just these questions. And that's the figure that I have in mind, is José Vasconcelos. This is a piece of political art from I think it was the 1930s, and it just cracks me up. This is hilarious. Okay, but anyway, there's Vasconcelos pointing to a future. So for this audience, I think I probably don't have to say a lot about him. His picture shows up on the back of buses around here. So, and we're supposed to be thinking autonomía right now. So Vasconcelos, for those of you who don't already happen to know a fair amount about Vasconcelos, he's sort of the Ozymandias of Mexican philosophy, whose cultural stature is not in dispute. I mean, he's a significant major figure, but whose work tends to be regarded as a colossal wreck. Studied only in the remnants of a monumental but apparently failed project. He was notorious, complicated, massively prolific. I mean, annoyingly prolific. I mean, his collected works are like 4,000 pages, and they don't even have all of his works in it. But I think by the end of his life, it's pretty clear that there wasn't a lot of serious scholarly engagement with his work. So it's not that people didn't write about him, and it's not about that people didn't take up some of his ideas, but in terms of like a sustained body of scholarly philosophical work on Vasconcelos, by the end of his life, there wasn't a lot of that going on at the time. So he's a kind of very interesting and notorious figure in the history of philosophy in Mexico. And now, here's one of these cases where, though, that the significance of Vasconcelos changes depending on what side of the border you're on. So in the United States, the situation's a little bit different, given the role of, in particular, his 1925 book, La Raza Cósmica, in the Chicano Movement. So in the Chicano Movement in the 1960s, there is a kind of formation of a political movement that in various ways explicitly and implicitly ties itself back to this work by Vasconcelos. Now, the influence here is a little complicated because the influence is more by reputation than by scholarship. So as Stavans has put it, La Raza Cósmica is a classic, but people don't read it. And even at the time of the formation of the Chicano movement, this seemed to be true. That is, there were these invocations about yea mestizaje, yea a fifth race, yea a future of the Americas in a mestizo population, and references to La Raza, and the idea of La Raza became kind of part and parcel of the language and vocabulary of the Chicano movement. And so the work was mainly recognized as a kind of early pro-race mixing manifesto. And so all of this was an important part of Vasconcelos' legacy in the United States, and all the complexity and notoriety that he has in Mexico is almost entirely not at all visible in the United States. So, interesting footnote. One consequence of Vasconcelos' role, especially in the Chicano movement, was that there was a kind of regular, small but regular discussion of his work continuously in the United States for the past 60 to 70 years. And I think this is really remarkable. I mean, that is in the sense that he's probably the only and best known figure from the history of philosophy in Mexico. And he's been kind of, there's a kind of constant trickle of articles and books that have been written about him in that kind of context. But in general, there's little or no attention paid to his wider philosophical commitments that shape the work. So here's what I'm going to do today. So today, part of what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to convince you that Vasconcelos is more interesting than you thought. Right? More interesting than you thought. And the goal in particular is to reconstruct his work on race and culture and to think about it as providing resources and tools for thinking about normatively appealing large-scale social binding projects. That's where I'm going to go with the piece. Now, and if you need a claim to get you thinking that I clearly and obviously don't know what I'm talking about, it's this. I'm going to claim that race isn't actually that philosophically central to La Raza Cósmica, right? Even though it's in the title. Okay, so that's where we're going to go with all of this. All right. So Vasconcelos wrote several books in the 20s that were on race, culture, nationalism, and this collection of works include La Raza Cósmica, from which it's just really the prologue, the intro part of the first edition that gets widely used, and then there was a second prologue that he did for the second edition that gets read and cited. But then he revisits these ideas in Indología, which was published the next year, and also in a series of lectures he gave at the University of Chicago, Aspects of Mexican Civilization, that was published in 1926. Small footnote about that, this work wasn't actually available in Spanish until 10 years ago. And what's very interesting about it is that it's a straight up revisiting and recapitulation of the themes in La Raza Cósmica, but way less crazy. And so it marks an important kind of difference. I think there's a way in which its aspects, which is you get the kind of mature version of the view that shows up in La Raza Cósmica, even though almost no one reads it. And even in the U.S., it had been out of print for ages and ages and ages. But here's the other thing. That when people read and talk about Vasconcelos and his work on race and culture that he was writing during this time period, almost nobody reads everything that he wrote about it. And partly it's because he wrote so much that it was impossible to do that. But part of it is because his writing was scattered over a ton of different things. So, for example, the play that he wrote that was published, I think, in roughly 1920, Prometeo Vencedor. This is a play that almost nobody reads because, like, you don't read Vasconcelos for his playwright work. But in it, he tells a mythology about a raza celeste that gets unified by a ambition for an aesthetic utopia. Again, these themes show up in a bunch of his later works. He comes back and revisits them. Revolución, I think, is one of the places where he revisits these things. So he comes back to these things, but it also turns out that a lot of the crucial pieces show up in newspaper articles, some of which I think were never collected in, so far as I can tell, in works here in Mexico. So, for example, there's an article he wrote on white supremacy that was published in a newspaper in San Antonio. It was a Spanish-language newspaper in San Antonio, Texas, and I don't think I've ever seen it in any of the collections here. So this is part of the problem, is that he published internationally, he published in multiple languages, he wrote in English, so his English language lectures, unless somebody made an effort to translate them back, didn't always appear. So he's got a variety of things that were published in English that didn't get translated into Spanish. So it makes it difficult to track where this guy's views are and what all the pieces are. But here I think is roughly the racial historical story that he tells that's mostly consistent across these works. And it goes something like this. He says, look, there are four races. Each of these four races, and he calls them different things in different places, but then he eventually settles on a color scheme for them: white, black, red, and yellow. And so the idea is he thinks that there are these four races, and that each of these races had a period of historical dominance under which they produced civilizations that structured the historical fabric of that time period. Interestingly and importantly, on the Vasconcelos' explicit version of the view, it's specifically a racial theory. He's committing himself to the existence of these races as races, and he does think that there's got a kind of biological underpinning to them, but he's insistent that there isn't a hierarchy to them. What you have are epochs or periods or eras of racial dominance, but that these are cyclical, that they don't always persist in perpetuity. Now, there's some complexity here that we're going to come back to, because I think this is a case where Vasconcelos is his committed principles and what his theory says are different than the things he says along the way, because he says all kinds of racist things along the way. So, there's these different Vasconceloses here. But currently we're living in the era of the white race, he insists, and on his picture, civilization, so he has a difference between races and civilizations. So civilizations are what we would now call sort of roughly geopolitical networks organized around mainly urban centers in his treatment that have distinctive cultural norms. Right? So he thinks that internal to a given race, there can be multiple civilizations, and those civilizations can be in conflict with one another. You might even want to say there could be a clash of civilizations. Okay, that's to cheat. So his claim is that there are that high cultural achievement eras, and this is an important part of the story that I think a lot of people don't fixate on, but he says high culture achievement eras are products of trying to reconcile cultural and dispositional differences in groups. So what he thinks is that when all the civilizations you've heard of, the ancient Greeks, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, he thinks in all of these cases of any notable and successful cultural flourishing, he thinks it was a product of some political, national, whatever the relevant unit is, group that attempts to try to impose order and reconcile big differences across groups. And he thinks that this forces a kind of cultural vitality on anybody who's engaged in this project. It's difficult to pull off, but when you pull it off, you get a kind of cultural flourishing, he thinks, that emerges from this. So what's going on right now when he's writing this in the mid-1920s? Well, he thinks during that period of time, there are kind of two main civilizational strands. It's the era of the white race. The white race is dominant across the planet, he thinks, but there's a fight going on. And it's a civilizational fight. It's a civilizational fight between two strands, the English and the Spanish, or roughly the Anglo-Saxon and the Latin strands. That's the claim. And the question is, which way is it going to go? Well, he thinks these groups have different dispositions towards the fact of race mixing, and this is, at first pass, fairly central. So he thinks the English, for example, the English and their offspring, who are our friends up north, the United States, big fans of racial purity and racial segregation. So when he's writing this in the 1920s, of course, this was true both by law in the United States. So, for example, desegregation of schools hadn't happened in the United States. It was illegal in many parts of the United States to marry people who were not members of your racial group. And so this was part of the world he was looking at. And he said, in contrast, the Spanish or Latin countries have a higher tolerance for race mixing. And he chalks this up to a larger integrative impulse in disposition and practice. Now, part of what's interesting about this is that he's not obviously committed to the view that these are countries that are always equally enthusiastic about race mixing. The point is a kind of comparative point about the tolerance for race mixing. And so he thinks the fact of mestizos and the Spanish cultural influence in Latin America means that you get a greater chance to eventually produce this thing he's super interested in, the synthetic, fifth, final, celestial, cosmic race. He uses different language in different places at different times. Okay, so that's the Vasconcelos that probably all of you have heard of. That should be the familiar Vasconcelos. Yes? So far, so good? All right. Okay, so a little bit of background. The philosophical anthropology that's in the back of this story. So I think some of this stuff is helpful to know, partly to see and appreciate what the heck is going on. Because if all the Vasconcelos is that you know is that racial story, there are going to be lots of places where you should be scratching your head and wondering, what the heck is going on in this story? So here's part of how that story goes. So Vasconcelos has a kind of view about kind of hierarchically or emergent structural properties to his ontology. So he thinks, look, at the basic unit of organization, what he calls the mineral level of organization, you don't have a lot in the way of purposes and ends, but you get to biology, and then you begin to develop purposes and ends that get fixed by biological impulses. So the needs for food, for reproduction, and so on. But then there are creatures that get a certain kind of self-awareness, and these creatures that have a certain kind of self-awareness, they are at what he calls the revulsion level of, this is the vocabulary he uses, of spiritual organization. And here he goes in different ways at different times about how he uses the idea of the spiritual, but the idea is supposed to be that some subset of the biological are beings that have aesthetic, transcendent, collective interests that aren't reducible to biology. Right? That's the idea. And he's, of course, talking about human beings. But he thinks, importantly, humans have to move through these stages of social relations. That is, that there are stages of social relations that structure human relations, and that really, though, of course, we have raw matter to our nature, we are biological beings, that we have a very difficult time, in some sense, transcending our biology. So the animal impulses that we've inherited, constantly a problem for creatures like us. And so the question is how to get over and past that. Well, so part of what, so 1920s, when he's writing all of this, eugenics is a big thing, both in Mexico and the United States. A huge amount of enthusiasm about eugenics, and it's clear that La Raza Cósmica and the other books and articles that were written at this time were partly against the backdrop of eugenics. And he thinks, look, eugenics efforts, social Darwinism, these are efforts that are just misapplications of the biological to spiritual beings. So he thinks, however good your Darwinian story is, it's always going to be an incomplete story because it's going to turn out that we're creatures that can step back from our biological impulses and make choices that don't just immediately flow from our direct biological imperatives. And in general, he thinks rational and empirical inquiry underdetermine the ends for spiritual beings. So he thinks we can always ask this kind of question about whether or not our biological purposes are served, but we can ask a further question about whether or not this choice or that choice is a choice that is loving, whether it is a spiritual choice, whether it's an aesthetic or beautiful choice. And so he thinks that these kinds of things, these underdetermination problems where he thinks the theories don't settle out how we should think about these things, do get properly settled by normative and aesthetic interests. And he thinks this is actually quite common. So small footnote here. This is actually an interesting and relatively early deployment of the theory underdetermination issue in philosophy of science. So what he says, and this shows up in a variety of different places, that science and logic, of course, have to constrain what theories we pick, but for human social organization, we're always going to need to supplement that with, he likes to call it aesthetic knowledge. It's not always clear that it's aesthetic in the sense in which we would ordinarily talk about it, but the idea is supposed to be that there are going to be these cases where scientific theories just underdetermine which view we should hold about some or another thing. And he thought this was the view in biology at the time about whether or not we should think social Darwinism is true or whether or not we should go in for a kind of Mendelian crossbreeding is better kind of story. And he said, look, these are both biological theories, but the biological facts don't settle these questions, and there's a kind of question about which adoption of which of these theories does us better given that they're both on empirical grounds on equal footing. And here it just looks like we're using non-scientific values to settle out a question that is in science, and this looks like a kind of classic case of values being used to settle theory underdetermination problems of the sort that really kind of takes off in Anglophone philosophy of science in roughly the 1980s. Okay, so some complexities about the story. So there's a kind of the background context about what's going on in Vasconcelos. But there are a couple of things that have to be acknowledged right off the bat about the crazy, terrible stuff in Vasconcelos. And so I'm just going to get this out of the way so that we can then move on to the rest. So first of all, if you read, especially in La Raza Cósmica, less so in some of the other pieces. This is stuff that gets attenuated in aspects and in Indología and some of the other places. But the history is just grotesquely untenable. There's these references, this belief and optimism that it's going to turn out that the indigenous peoples of the Americas are really descended from Atlantis. So we carry the blood of Aquaman in our... So there's lots of the history that is just like, there's no one would want to defend bits and pieces of the history. There's also a kind of complicated set of questions about the theory of racial kinds. That's actually a mural from a hotel up in the north of Mexico that was a mural that was done on the basis of La Raza Cósmica. And you get your gratuitous male nudity for the talk. Okay, so one of the things I think is super interesting about the racial kinds in Vasconcelos that doesn't get a lot of attention is you see that Vasconcelos is moving back and forth between kind of a broadly Lamarckian and broadly Mendelian conception of biological race. So he does think there are biological races, but it looks like on the picture he has, what you have are temporarily stabled racial essences, but that they're always susceptible to transformation from culture and geography. So the temporary stable part, that's the part that looks like it's got this Mendelian bit of the story, and the idea that we can identify racial essences, that looks like that's the kind of Mendelian inheritance. But at the time at which he was writing, the distinctions between Mendelian and Lamarckian approaches to inheritance weren't super worked out, and there was a lot of ambiguity in the biological literature at the time about how this stuff went, especially in the kind of intellectual milieu in which he was writing. So part of the thought was that whatever your racial configuration is, that is susceptible to change, depending on all sorts of external factors can go and alter the racial configuration. But it makes it a little difficult to try to read off a straight story from him about how he's thinking about races. But then, of course, there are also, very famously, the terrible racist tropes in La Raza Cósmica. Like, if you didn't know that it was an anti-racist tract, you would sure think it's a racist tract. Because all of the stereotypes are all just kind of grotesque, simplistic racial stereotypes. Interestingly, a lot of that stuff gets attenuated in the works that he wrote subsequently. And this is one of the cases where I think it's actually just, does Vasconcelos it does him no credit whatsoever that everybody reads La Raza, which is the terrible version, and then the mature version that has like less obviously racist content in it tends to not get read as often. So not that it's not problematic in different ways. Okay, so, and then I guess there's also an interesting question that has to be noted here when we start talking about the kind of ideology of mestizaje, and that's the worry that mestizaje is bad for minority groups, especially indigenous groups. So there's this kind of criticism has been raised in a lot of different kinds of contexts. In the U.S. context, a very early statement of it came from Jack Forbes, Native American Studies professor at UC Davis, who ran the following argument back in '73 that mestizaje was actually a tool for cultural and European imperialism, and it was designed, amongst other things, to ensure the eradication of indigenous groups. How and why? Well, by the erasure of the ability of these groups to self-identify as indigenous groups. So the idea is, it turns out that if you've got, not all indigenous communities, but many indigenous communities had different standards for what counted as membership in the group. But if the defining social political order decides to treat anybody who has a non-indigenous parent as mixed or mestizo, then you can over time chip away at the numbers of indigenous peoples in your official record keeping and erase people's ability to readily self-identify in that way. So there's a kind of liquidation worry that what happens is that the idea and invention of mestizaje ends up effectively serving as a tool to erase the significance of indigenous populations over time. So that's a kind of worry that I think always needs to kind of be lurking in the background about when one gets to talking about the Vasconcelos and the ideology of mestizaje. Okay, so here's a question that you should be asking yourself, that given everything that's wrong, especially with La Raza Cósmica, is there anything of value left in the work? Or is it just a giant waste pit? I think this is a fair question. And I think the answer is yes, but I think more details are required. So let's do that. So there's going to be what I call aesthetic utopianism here. And so here I think this plays an important role in seeing what's interesting and promising about the Vasconcelos story. So one thing to keep in mind is that the point about the fifth race stuff that one sees in the work, and the why is he calling for a fifth race, is because he's interested in securing a universal or a fully human culture. That's what this whole story is on about. And I think the race stuff in some sense is a distraction from it. So that is, what's the ambition of the project in this series of works from the mid to late 20s? The answer is, he wants to figure out how we could produce a human culture under which human difference isn't a barrier to taking on whatever the cultural attributes are of distinct groups of people. Now, there's a way in which the idea here is, I mean, to put it really bluntly, the way he seems to be thinking about this is, the thought is, like, what would the best culture be? Well, the best human culture would be a universal human culture that could take on board the cultural achievements wherever they are and by whomever it is that produces them. But how are you going to get that? How are you going to get people who are willing to take on board cultural achievements that come from outsiders and that are members not of their group? Well, he thinks one way you could do that is going to be by having a group of people that self-identify as sufficiently mixed such that they don't, in fact, feel alien. So there's a way in which you might think the old line that gets attributed to your various favorite classical authors about nothing is alien to me, everything is familiar to me in virtue of being human. That line Vasconcelos, I think, is skeptical of, because of course he thinks that's not the unit at which people identify. People don't identify as human in a lot of contexts. In a lot of contexts they need some other kind of more robust group identification. And so La Raza Cósmica and the story about a kind of aesthetic utopianism that we get to a society that selects from the best, the most beautiful, the most interesting, the most integrative kinds of things, we only get that, I think he thinks, if we have a way of binding people into a kind of cultural, a shared sense of cultural sensibility. So his question is, what would secure those goods of cooperation, civilization, and culture in the face of perpetual flux in human group membership? And I think this is a feature that goes really frequently missed when people read these works, is Vasconcelos keeps looping back to this question about, well, look, there's no such thing as any nation or people or community that is permanently stable. The fact of mixing of people, whether it's race mixing or language mixing or religion mixing or what have you, he just takes for granted. And he says, look at your history. There are no pure, by whatever metric you like, communities that are stable over time. So there's a kind of fundamental question about, well, so how do you get binding up and running across human communities, given that human communities will always be changing the nature of the membership of the group? He thinks, in particular, nationalism isn't really great for this. Nationalism has a terrible time dealing with the fact of transformations in the makeup of its body politic. Again, I'll let you think of examples. The one way you could go is you could just go top-down imposition of imperial power, right? So you could have your multi-ethnic, diverse, multi-religious states that get by with the imposition of imperial power. But there's an interesting question about whether or not we can do better. Can we do better than nationalisms? Can we do better than imperialisms? What are our choices? Okay, that's the question I think is really going on in this chunk of Vasconcelos' writing. So here's the answer he gives, I think. So the answer grows out of thinking of this thing that he calls the law of three stages. So here's the idea of the law of three stages. He says, the human beings go through a kind of a predictable typology of primary forms of human social organization. So at the very beginning is the material power stage. And this is the stage where it's just force and threat, right? The way you deal with your 4-year-old. No, you probably don't. You probably have nice, thoughtful discussions with 4-year-olds, and you say things like that you couldn't universalize the maximum upon which you're acting. No, so we don't have those kinds of conversations with 4-year-olds. We engage in force and threat talk. Some of us. Okay, I revealed too much. But then there's what he calls the intellectual, rational, or political stage, and this is where we invent or construct for ourselves binding principles, so laws, treaties, mutually beneficial agreements, and eventually strong social norms, including moral and political norms. So he says, look, most of the time we're organized around the second. Sometimes we organize human communities around the first, but we rarely or never organize ourselves around this third feature about us. And notice, this maps onto the story about revulsions. That is, at the mineral level, the biological level, so we just have power, force, threats. Then we have intellectual, rational abilities that are satisfying a kind of instrumental reasoning allows us to satisfy biological ends. But then we have that, what he identifies as a spiritual or aesthetic component. And he says we have the possibility of human relations structured by love, joy, and creative expression. And here's the question that Vasconcelos is trying to get you to think about. What would it be for us to have a society that was organized around human relations that were structured by love, joy, and creative expression? So he says, look, we have lots of societies that are organized around laws, that are set up around mutually beneficial agreements. We have lots of societies that have moral and political norms that structure us in different kinds of ways. We have plenty of history of societies organized around force of threat. But how many societies do we have that take as a central organizing principle something like human relations structured by love, joy, and creative expression? But of course, many of us, maybe not all of us, many of us would love to have lives that were filled with joy, creative expression, and love. Some of you are like, no, I hate all of those things. I live for my violent anger towards my enemies. I like to be depressed. I like when it's rainy and overcast. And I only like to watch the same show over and over and over again. Creative expression sucks. So Vasconcelos' thought is, look, we haven't yet figured out how to build a society that enables human relations on a fairly regular basis to be built on the basis of spiritual, aesthetic kinds of relations. And the question is, what would it take for us to get that? Could we undertake a society that would get us that? Well, so that's the question. right? Now, I think we can fight a little bit about whether or not this is in fact utopic. But the idea, this is Zootopia, if you haven't seen it, great movie, especially with kids. Okay, so La Raza Cósmica, I think, isn't entirely utopic, partly because I think he thinks it's inevitable that race mixing is going to happen. So the basic pressures that he's trying to discuss, he thinks this is a future that is coming for us, whether you like it or not. But the aesthetic state that he thinks comes out at the end, he thinks that this mixture, this fifth race, will produce an aesthetic state that's built around these principles, et cetera. That starts to look like it by the time he gets done talking about it. But I think it's an interesting question to ask, well, what would that look like? So here's one idea. So you might think, and this is all just mining the Vasconcelos from this period about what he thinks that aesthetic state would look like, is it looks like what we might, like to borrow the language of Galison, might look like a trading zone, an aesthetic trading zone where the thought is something like you've got lots of local attempts to try to get harmonization with the widest range of dispositions that groups of people have, but where there's a big fixation on producing distinctive cultural products that are excellent instances of that kind, and where the aesthetic sensibilities are going to be in flux, but where you're going to try and to be responsive to those things and to produce things that are creative of the possibility of interpersonal integration and integration across wide ranges of aesthetic sensibilities. Now, at various points in time, he characterizes this as aesthetic eugenics, and he says, here's an example of something that would have to happen. And I think this is kind of Vasconcelos is a kind of complicated case to be talking about this. But the idea of marriage as a work of art is one of the cases that he comes back to and wants to emphasize that, think there are cases in which, imagine your prototypical caveman days, marriages were based on force of threat. Imagine then contractual marriages emerge under legal systems. But now he says, imagine what marriages that were built around the possibility of love, and he thinks that the development of love marriages, which he notes in many ways was a relatively recent development, is a step in the right direction, but it's not as though people think of their marriages typically as works of art. And so, Carlos accepted. So there's a kind of interesting question about what would that have to be like. I won't pretend to know. I'm somebody else's work of art, maybe. No, I don't know. But you might think that's the ambition, is to point us in the direction of thinking about these kinds of questions. So. Last bit about this is in order for a culture that had these features to be truly universal, of course, it would have to require the participation of everybody, or at least be open to everybody to participate in it. So this, I think, is a very interesting and distinctive feature about his picture about what a future aesthetic state would be like. It's an aesthetic state that has to be, at least in principle, open to anybody. It's an open border state. Okay. So, big basic problem. Purity and intrahuman hostility to outgroups is a pervasive barrier to achieving the third state of social relations, right? So we're worried about purity, we're worried about intrahuman hostility, and in particular, dominant groups invent myths of purity. So take any dominant group anywhere, it doesn't take long for them to invent a story about their own purity and about the need to protect their purity from incursions from outgroups. And even when you recognize the fact of of your own mixed nature, you're always at risk of being defeated by a population that does have a purity myth, right? So suppose we all here in this room, we nod our heads in the way of the post-revolutionary Mexican state, and we're all mixed here now today, right? So suppose we thought that. That's great, but it's only as good as long as our local mythology can persist, because if we get overrun by a population that's a big enthusiast about racial purity, now we're back to where we started. And until now, he thinks, mixture of people has never been truly global. Right? It wasn't even possible until relatively recently in human history that you could have genuine mixing because there were too many isolated populations. But he thinks that there is a kind of interesting possibility here, but here's the thing, is that if we were to get something like this to happen, it would have to emerge in a real concrete place with a history. And so how do you get to utopia given the fact of all of these problems and the fact of concrete real material histories? Well, I think that's what this project is an attempt to answer. So towards a solution. So here's how I think we should be thinking about this body of work. So I think the part to pay attention to in the title isn't the part that says raza or cósmica. It's the misión part. So I think the right way to understand what's going on in this body of work is this is mainly about a cultural ideal for a specific place. It's an aspirational goal or a normative project. And the idea is he's trying to suggest that, look, there's a thin framework for pursuing a certain kind of cultural human universalism that can create the conditions conducive to full, non-biased integration of all peoples. That's the way you're going to get your universalism. That's going to be how you get your cosmopolitanism. It isn't from thinking about humans as such. It's from thinking about humans in our diverse, different individual groupings, and then to saying what we want is to bind all that together in a local story. And so part of his thought is what we want to have happen in Latin America is he wants to get Latin America there first. Others can join that project or not. Bear in mind, it's an open border story, right? So other people can join the project if they like. But the goal is to encourage Latin America to get there. So here's the sense in which I think this is not mainly about race. He says it's not. He says, no nation's ever risen to true greatness without an ardent faith in some high ideal. Hint, I'm about to give you a high ideal, he says. Broadness, universality of sentiment and thought in order to fulfill the mission of bringing together all the races with the purpose of creating a new type of civilization. I believe the ideal that would give us in Latin America strength and vision. Right? So notice, the race talk isn't in this at all. It's about a kind of cultural mission that is about producing a certain kind of civilization that helps enable the achievement of a certain kind of systematic possibility of human relations. And anyway, who wouldn't want to have human relations have free play of aesthetic sensibility within a framework of biological and rational requirements? So he says other things in this way. We can talk about other places where he makes explicit that it's not a story about race so much as it's a story about cultural mission. So the philosophical central ambition here is to bring about a new form of social relation. Race mixing is a means, but not really the goal. The main thing is to stop patrolling race. He wants us to stop worrying about keeping different races or other groups out so that we can get the cultural goodies that come from it. Of course, his framing invites us to focus on the race stuff, but in his mature writings from 26 forward, the focus is clearly on culture and politics. I mean, I just love this crock pots. That is like such a U.S. thing to use in cooking, is the idea of a crock pot, and then Korean barbecue tacos. This is that's the cosmic food right there. Okay, so let me step back now. Let's get to see if we can get some deliverables out of all of this. So here's the question you should be asking. Yeah, Manuel, you keep promising me that you're thinking about the history of Mexican philosophy is useful for thinking about issues in contemporary philosophy, and that if I'm a contemporary philosopher who doesn't really care at all about the history of philosophy, much less the history of Mexican philosophy, I want to know why any of this is going to be useful for me going forward. Okay, so the project of a people. So I'll just pick up a place in the analytic political philosophy literature I think has had an interesting discussion, and that's the patriotism literature. So in the patriotism literature, in the Anglophone analytic philosophy literature, there's this interesting discussion about whether or not there are grounds for tolerating or requiring special partiality large-scale collectives. Patriotism, right? So that is patriotism rational? Is it morally permissible? Or is it morally impermissible to be committed to preferring your nation state above other groups? So famous article written by Alistair McIntyre on this, and his position is he thinks that it goes something like this. Look, all your moral principles, all your moral content, it all comes from a specific, being anchored in a specific community. You learn it in a particular place. You learn it in a community. And it only makes sense relative and indexed to that community and way of living. So partiality to that community in the form of a nation, he thinks, is at least permissible and maybe required. Right? So he thinks, look, good luck understanding and making any moral and political principles absent, deriving those and getting them from a community. They only make sense in that place. And so given that you're getting your things from a nation, it makes sense that you would have a certain kind of commitment to the nation and a certain kind of preference to the nation. The upshot is that patriotism, though, is commitment not to a nation as a specific group of people, but to a nation conceived of as a project. That's the slogan he uses, right? So the idea to be a patriot is to be somebody who's committed to the nation conceived of as a project, not the nation as it might be instantiated. You might be a patriot and despise the current office holders. You might be a patriot and be really unhappy about lots of ways in which institutions are set up, but the thing that makes you a patriot is you're committed to a certain kind of project that you understand the nation in terms of. Right? So that's the idea. Now, I mean, it's philosophy, so there's going to be worries. One is the conditions that the acquisition of moral content doesn't preclude rational dissociation. So that is, look, just because you got your moral commitments from a nation doesn't mean that you can't, over time, rationally dissociate from that. You might think, look, moral thought can detach, it can transform, it can be subject to rational, internalizing coherence pressures that move you away from whatever the commitments were of the community where you acquired these things. So you might wonder, given that you can do that, does the nation state get a kind of claim of partiality from you at all? But you might even think, look, even if we accept this kind of cognitive communitarianism, that is, the way you think about moral stuff is always anchored into a community, you might wonder why it's the state that gets your commitments as opposed to your family or your town or your religion. Right? You might even think, look, here's who really gets it, your mom. Right? Your mom gets partiality because that's where you learn your moral commitments from. But the nation? Like, do we really get our moral commitments from a nation? Okay, so that's the kind of some back and forth on the patriotism literature. Here's the thing I want to invite you to think a little bit about. Can we do better thinking with Pepe? All right, that's Vasconcelos. Okay, so here's one of the things. Think about this. Vasconcelos' Mission for a People, I think, is a very close analog with MacIntyre's Nation as a project. That is, they're both stories about normative aspirations that organize a community and then subsequently have a claim to the partiality of its members. Vasconcelos' goal is about the realization of our natures, aesthetic, spiritual natures, and what's valuable about that. How does it solve the group binding problem? Well, roughly, Vasconcelos' thought is we, a people with this particular history, are the people well suited to bring about human universalism. We're the best chance to overcome aversions to impurity. So if it doesn't happen in Latin America, is it going to happen in places where they're really bound up with racial purity and racial segregation? He thinks not a promising place for that to happen. Small footnote, he does note in one of his diaries somewhere that, that if it doesn't happen in Latin America, it might happen in California. Okay, so the place that gave you barbecue Korean tacos. Okay, so there's this thought. But then the question is, how do we avoid pernicious tribalism? That was the other challenge. Well, notice that the aesthetic community, that aesthetic state, is supposed to be elective, non-imperialistic. It's not supposed to be coercive. He's very explicit about this. It's not supposed to go around conquering other communities. And it's supposed to valorize difference and diversity. So you get a binding story and a defense against tribalism. So it looks like on the Vasconcelos view, we should have partiality to a large-scale collective project because this group, this particular historically specific group, is uniquely well-positioned to bring about a certain kind of universalism, and it allows us to realize our natures and a maximal kind of human good with, I should read there, without a pernicious kind of tribalism. Right? That's the needle he's trying to thread. That's the project. Okay? So I think it's very interesting to think about the comparison between the MacIntyre patriotism piece and the Vasconcelos cultural aestheticism piece. Well, what about nationalism more generally? So a distinctive feature about Vasconcelos' account is its commitment to presuming diversity in humankinds and the inevitability of change in institutional political arrangements. And there's a kind of test case, I think, for thinking about that, and that's just to ask what, if anything, can Vasconcelos' account say about popular nationalisms of the racial or the cultural variety. And I actually think Vasconcelos' story is no silver bullet, but it does have super interesting things to say. Small footnote, really eerie thing for me, I was talking with Fernando about this the other night. So I wrote this bit about, like, what does Vasconcelos have anything to say about popular nationalisms and cultural nationalisms? And of course, this is a live and important issue in the United States right now. So I just got done writing this section about what would Vasconcelos say about cultural nationalists when that set of shootings occurred literally the next day after I wrote these things. I went and go to read one of the manifestos by one of the shooters, and it's almost point for point on things that Vasconcelos was very worried about having something to say. So small footnote. Okay, so what are the Vasconcelosian tools on racial nationalism? So I'm going to look at two different versions of nationalism: racial nationalism and cultural nationalism, and then think about whether or not there's something about the Vasconcelos story tells us something or allows us to say something any better. So on the racial nationalism story, notice that Vasconcelos accepts race talk, right? So he doesn't have any problem with race. He grants that there are races. He's committed to there being races. But he's got a debunking story about racial purity. Right? So he thinks, look, there are races, just don't think that there's racial purity, because what races are is just temporary stabilizations of dispositions and traits that transform over time. And that any stability or essence of a racial group is contingent, and I think this part's very important, that replacement can and will inevitably happen. Right? He just says, anybody who thinks it can't and doesn't inevitably happen hasn't been paying attention to human history. Just look at human history. Whatever happened to the Thracians? Right? Or pick a million other groups that have disappeared over time. So replacement can and will inevitably happen. The purity story, he thinks, is just a myth used by a dominant group as a tool for social regulation. And of course, all dominant groups themselves arose from prior mixtures. Trace any dominant group back as far enough back as you like, and you'll find a mixture of a different population, conceived of in different ways. But time, globalization, and technology make the purity myth harder for us to sustain now. So I think Vasconcelos' thought is it's only going to keep getting more and more urgent. So for those of you who are fans of racial nationalism, you've got a problem coming. And the problem is, of course, the fact that globalization and technology are just going to make it harder and harder to retain sharp boundaries between groups constituted any way you like, but especially in the racial ways. So Vasconcelos' thought is, look, he's going to give you more realism about the inevitability of mixtures of people, about the destabilization that's going to follow from that, but how to try to get social binding in the face of it. So that's what he wants to say to the racial nationalist. Right? So to the racial nationalist, he says, give up. Right? You're not going to get racial purity. You can't defend it over time. Technology and globalization are going to do that in, and the tide of human history has always done it in. What makes you think you're so special that you're going to escape it? Okay? On cultural nationalism. Quick footnote here. So cultural nationalism has a kind of different configuration. So the idea of cultural nationalism goes something like this. Look, our problem, I'll say this in the voice of the cultural nationalist. The cultural nationalist says, look, our problem isn't with other races. I don't care about other races. Whatever your race is fine. My worry is about other people's cultures. They come to our country, they bring the wrong kind of culture with them, and that culture is corrosive to the greatness of our local culture. I'm not a racist, I'm a culturalist. Right? That's the view. Now let's suppose that this isn't just racial nationalists trying to be respectable. I think it's an open question about to what extent are cultural nationalists just also racists who are using cultural nationalism as a kind of smokescreen. But suppose that cultural nationalism, some people defend it genuinely, and it's not a ploy. I think Vasconcelos is very interesting on this front, because Vasconcelos is, in some sense, a kind of cultural nationalist himself. He's an enormous apologist for white European culture. An enormous apologist. I mean, he wrote a book about how great Cortés was. He condemned subnational identities repeatedly. He repeatedly condemned subnational identities as in some or another way impinging or undercutting the distinctive cultural configuration that had arisen in Latin America. And he recognized the threat of replacementism. That is the thought that immigration and demographic changes can, in fact, transform cultural milieus. So Vasconcelos talks all the same talk that this average traditional cultural nationalist wants to go in for. But, and this is the really interesting part, is that Vasconcelos is ruthlessly realistic about this. He just thinks, look, you can't stop numerical replacement. You can try to close your borders, but it's not going to work. And you can try to save a cultural configuration, but it's not going to work. And how do we know this? Because we have thousands of years of human history in which it has never succeeded. So what do you do if you're a cultural nationalist? Well, he says, here's what you can do. You can require full social integration of outgroups and stop fighting it. You can just say, no, here's what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to get them to integrate, and we're going to try to get them to select themselves for integration with us. We're going to try to build our society in such a way that we can assimilate and integrate and take them on board such that they're going to want to end up, and think back to the idea of these trading zones, these cultural trading zones that try to harmonize difference. That's what the utopia was supposed to be like. And this is the ambition. And go back to the one of the very first things I said about what Vasconcelos thinks about where the greatest cultural achievements can be found. They're in civilizations that were forced to integrate and to try to bring into harmony groups that had very different, wildly different kinds of commitments. And this forces a kind of cultural flourishing, he thinks. So he thinks that's the way to go. Success requires ensuring conditions for the flourishing and social integration. So that gets us cultural vitality, he thinks. Of course, cultural configurations are always local, and the most vital, though, he thinks, are this result of that kind of integration I was just talking about. To be satisfied with a cultural status quo, though, or to simply preserve or recover a past is to stagnate. Right? So this is the other part where he departs from the cultural nationalist. He says, yeah, your culture might be great, but if you want to preserve that, that's a fast way to die. And it cuts you off from the full resources of human culture. So he says, sure, have your purity if you like it, but notice what you're doing. You're committing yourself to stagnation and you're cutting yourself off from all of the excellent ways of being human. So it's better off to seek universality. All right. We're here at the end. I take it goes something like this. To the extent to which Vasconcelos' cultural project has appeal, I think it's this. It's an aspiration for a community that's built to withstand the fact of social group change. And out-group integration is viewed as necessary, and it's valorized on this kind of picture. And I think, maybe, it's supposed to get you love, beauty, and joy. I mean, it's supposed to get you that. Whether or not it actually gets you that, I don't know. But notice that this kind of configuration about the cultural project has a very different profile than standard options do in this domain. Now, presumably, of course, there are real costs to this kind of project. So I mentioned one earlier about the possibility of minority subordination to assimilative pressures and whether or not this involves erasures of minority groups. I think this is an interesting and difficult question for this kind of view, and that requires more consideration than I'm going to be able to give it here. But even so, the overriding question, I think, is an important and urgent one, and that's just how do we get large-scale binding and cooperation without pernicious treatment of outgroups? I submit that Vasconcelos has at least an interesting and provocative view about how to do that. That's it.
Well, thank you, Manuel, for this reconstruction of Vasconcelos. I think that the most important part of this reconstruction is how you put less emphasis on the question of race and more of a question of civilization and humanity, etc. No, I mean it's like it has lots of advantages, I think, you see, because I think many people have clashed against this wall of racist and racial language and ideology that is in La Raza Cósmica, and that has not allowed them, you see, to see what's beyond that wall, you see. And I think that your project here is to say, look, let's put this thing away. No? Let's not talk about races. No? And what it's important, you say something else. You see, this is what it's idea, what the idea of history that we want to have, the idea of moral progress, of human civilization, of what is our idea of humanity. No? So I would agree with all of that. Okay. However, I think that the impression I have, as in other of your talks, you see, is that this reconstruction, you see, helps for some purposes, but not to others. You see. And for example, it worries me how you despolitizas. How would you say it in English?
Depoliticize.
Depoliticize. No? The way in which you depoliticize Vasconcelos' discourses. For example, there is a moment in which you talk about Vasconcelos' criticism of the idea of purity in races. That's important. But I think that what is most important in the case of Vasconcelos' discourse is his attack on the idea of racial superiorities. Mm-hmm. That's what is important. And I didn't find in your presentation these ideas. Why? Because you cannot understand, at least that is what I would claim, you see, La Raza Cósmica, if you don't take into account Vasconcelos' specific context, you see, personal and historical and cultural contexts. Who is the enemy of Vasconcelos in La Raza Cósmica? The enemy
the United States?
The enemy, first of all, is North American civilizations. And particularly, not only the idea of the purity of races, but furthermore, the idea of the superiority of races. It's the idea that whites are superior to all the races. And in no moment I saw, that you mentioned that idea. And this is what makes Vasconcelos' discourse in that moment so revolutionary, so interesting. Think, for example, that in Germany, what was considered to be the most advanced country of the world, the country with the highest science, technology, literature, philosophy, the idea of racial superiority was imposed in a legal manner. It was by law considered. And well, and in the United States was the same, as you sometimes mentioned. The idea was not only, the quest for purity, but the idea of superiority. And without having that in mind, I think that one cannot understand as well why, as you asked, Vasconcelos is so popular among Mexican Americans. Because Mexican Americans have suffered from these ideas of racial superiority, are considered as inferior human beings. And that is an experience that Vasconcelos had when in his childhood. He lived in his own flesh and bones that feeling. And that is why I think Mexican Americans find in Vasconcelos such an important figure. So, of course, the way in which you read Vasconcelos, help us to understand Vasconcelos from a, say, mainstream philosophy, as someone that had interesting ideas about humanity, about civilization, about history. It sounds like a very kind Vasconcelos. As if you had taken out all the spines of a chayote, of something, of a cactus. And then you can eat it, and it's sweet, and it sounds good, not tastes okay. But I think that's what is missing, and that's all I'm going to say. I could give you many other examples that probably we could talk about that later. Is that you are giving us a very sort of harmful Vasconcelos, harmless Vasconcelos, which takes away, I think, what really, really makes him such an important figure in the history of philosophy.
Yeah, thanks. Great. So, I think my suspicion is we don't really disagree. That is, I think it's very important the rejection of racial hierarchy, which from the rejection of racial hierarchy, it's partly intentionally a response to white supremacy. So one of the really interesting texts that a later version of it shows up in Indología, but when I was talking about the San Antonio paper, it's literally titled La Supremacía Blanca. Yeah, and so I think you're absolutely right that this is a central piece, and it's central about what makes Vasconcelos historically an important figure on these kinds of things. And another piece, I think the accusation of a depoliticized Vasconcelos is a fair accusation in this context, partly because also the dimensions about the worries about, in particular, U.S. imperialism, which are all over the works of this time period, and clearly a big part of the background of this. That piece I don't talk much about in the talk or in the paper, but I think the racial supremacy and the imperialism, for him, go together, and they're part of the background, especially when coupled with eugenics that he's worried about. And I think all of those things are absolutely true as part of the historical importance of the text and what's going on in these texts, and to fully understand what's going on in these texts. That said, as I noted at the outset, my goal here today with the recapitulation of Vasconcelos was partly to answer the question, what philosophical payoff is there for those of us who aren't interested in the history of philosophy? Why does it make sense to go back and read Vasconcelos? What is Vasconcelos going to tell us now that is going to be useful for projects going on now? Which is, I think, a different question than the question about why was he important in the history and what's the full context of all the moving pieces in the account. And so that was the sense in which I think where the parts of Vasconcelos that are, I think, in some sense most alive today have to do with trying to navigate those options between an optimistic but fragile cosmopolitanism and various forms of nationalism. And I think he's got a distinctive and interesting view that is not either of these things in any standard way. And so I think that's what I was trying to draw out. But I don't disagree that, in fact...
I don't agree with that, you see, because I think that's especially today, the question about whether in the U.S. you see, Mexicans are seen as inferior, you see, and therefore even more, you see, as a community that can be erased physically, as we saw what happened in El Paso. You see, it's the most important philosophical question that we can raise now. So I don't think we disagree about this, but here's the difference in the emphasis. So I don't think that the racial theory in Vasconcelos is philosophically alive today. What I do think is alive is Vasconcelos's tools for trying to respond to people who do have a racial theory. And that's the part I was trying to emphasize. And I think that all of the story about how do you respond to both racial and cultural nationalists, the things I was talking about at the very end, are, I think we don't disagree about the centrality of that and that being alive. I think that I think this is just a difference in framing, not a difference in content. But we can talk more.
Muchas gracias otra vez. Excelente plática. However, I have an issue with your reconstruction of Vasconcelos. I don't know Vasconcelos. I'm sorry, but the way you presented the three stages seem to float. I don't see how they're integrated with the rest of the proposal, and that is why the static part seems to, it just seems to come out of nowhere and then go nowhere, which would be surprising. So I wanted just to push you to say whether there is something in the limitations of the rational way of social binding that are linked to also the nationalist and the more, the other ways of organizing socially that need to be overcome in order to get real universalism, so that there you can see a parallelism between the three stages and the other issues that he's raised, or whether it does float within Vasconcelos' philosophy.
Yeah. Good. So so I should have said more. Though I'm finding these talks are going on so long that it just a priori can't be true that I should have said more. But on this point, I think, a couple of different things to be said. So Vasconcelos on nationalism has got this interestingly complicated view. So I think he goes in for, I think he thinks, look, a certain amount of, at one point he calls it defensive nationalism, and that language gets picked up by later figures downstream. But the idea of a defensive nationalism that states in Iberoamerica have to have a certain amount of nationalism to inoculate them against the cultural and political and economic incursions from outside. That seems like a kind of local and strategic thing, but I think oftentimes he seems to be very ambivalent about it, because I think at the end of the day he thinks like all the local nationalisms are in some sense have impaired the ability to create a enormous pan-regional project within Latin America that he thinks is the best and most promising way to, if there was a way to unify this gigantically diverse region, would be able to create the actual conditions under which we could start to move towards the kind of aesthetic utopia he gestures at. That's the claim. I think there are lots of reasons to raise an eyebrow about whether or not the aesthetic part is floating free and what motivates the aesthetic part. But I think
Well, you know, one way to try to paint the picture more seriously, and I mean, I think you'd have to do a lot of excavation and a lot of work to defend the story, but I think it goes something like this. The stage bit story is supposed to be something roughly like the following thought. I think it's not, you know, it's of that same family of views that you find at least as far back as Plato and Aristotle about there's some distinctively human set of components that is not reducible to our animality. And societies have done a terrible job of setting themselves up to enable the flourishing of human relations built around that distinctively human bit that is more than mere animality. And so I think that's the bit where the kind of spiritualism and aesthetic utopianism, that stuff is supposed to be a story about how he thinks that bit goes. But the basic structure, I think, is a relatively familiar one. And then it's an open question about whether or not, depending on how you flesh that piece out, whether or not we should think that those goods can or have been gotten as well as they can be gotten with the kinds of social institutions that we have right now. And I mean, I think a devoted fan of liberalism should just say, like, no, this is, you know, like, it's a terrible system except that it's better than all the rest. And I think then that's where the kind of nitty-gritty of the fight has to then go.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is what I think. I think that there's an aspect of Vasconcelos that would be very interesting for you to go into, and that's his Christianity. Mm-hmm. Because that explains a lot of the things that are a bit strange here, a bit weird. So I think, I'm not saying that you focus on that, because of course not, but it would explain. So I think something that's a bit missing in the puzzle has an explanation there, and that's all. Thanks a lot for your talk.
Thanks. Yeah. So let's see. I do think. I mean, this is one. So my bet is that we're going to have this conversation at least twice more this week, under which I do a reconstruction of a figure. And then there's quite reasonable questions to be asked about, well, look, but there are these elements of the historical version of the figure that are not in the account. And then I say, yeah, that's because my ambition here is not to give a full, historically accurate, sensitive of, let me just tell you what Vasconcelos said, but let me tell you what figure X is alive and useful and that we can mine from it. And so I do think any complete story about Vasconcelos is going to have to grapple with the role that his religious beliefs played. And I say religious beliefs partly because they were complicated and changed over time so dramatically in different ways. So the Vasconcelos who wrote, Estudios Indostánicos is a very different Vasconcelos than the Vasconcelos who wrote, the works in the 30s and 40s. And I think in the 20s, it's a little complicated because it's not clear to me anyway how much of the work in the 20s, which is this cluster of writings that I'm talking about, really are centrally driven by the Christianity so much as they're driven by the legacy of a kind of aesthetic mysticism that he'd had since the teens, really. So I mean, I think at this era, it's not clear to me anyway, and I have to spend more time trudging around it about whether or not Christianity really was doing much work at this stage, because I think some of the weirdness of the spiritualism in Vasconcelos predates his reconversion, as it were, back to Christianity. And so I think it's just unclear to me how to think about what's going on in that piece.
Yeah. There's a lot of influence from the Bible.
Sure.
So
yep.
It's just discussed.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi. Thank you so much for that talk. I am really happy to hear someone talk about national and cultural superiority and about the bad things that can happen with it, and about how politicians can use them to manipulate the masses and really make things worse, right, for the state of things. And I'm happy to hear someone talk about the bad things, but I would like to, coming from the Basque country, I think in Europe we do have, European supremacists, but we also have good examples of how what I think is good of some versions of some nationalisms in Europe. Like, for example, we have to treasure our languages as, richness, right? That should be kept alive if possible, right? So I don't think that this should be done at any cost. For example, I don't think immigrants should be made to or kind of push too hard to learn Basque, because it's very hard to learn, and they shouldn't be learning it for jobs, for example, right? So, but I do agree that some public money should be spent on this, and maybe some private money too. And we have had very good, as you know, the Basque language with Catalan and many other languages in Spain were forbidden during the dictatorship. Mm-hmm. So there was like a losing side and a winning side, and only the losing side would speak Basque, right? And that was very divisive of the society. And the fact that after the dictatorship ended, Basque was taught in every school. There's models from everything in Spanish and then one class in Basque, to everything in Basque and then one class in Spanish. There's all the levels, and then people choose what they want to involve themselves in. But it has been good for society, and I think it would be good for Mexico too. I don't know if that's crazy. I think that sounds a little crazy right now, but if things are going to get better, that's a good one step, and I think the sooner the better, right? I don't know if you agree with this.
So Mexico needs to learn to speak Basque.
No. Free Spanish classes for indigenous people who don't have time to go to school, mm-hmm. or and free, whatever the regional language is in each place in Mexico, free classes of that in every school, at least one class a week. And then that for a long time would be good for some social relations, I think. And it would be good for children to learn many languages since they are small. That's cognitively a good thing for a child. And yeah, I only see advantages, and I know it sounds a little bit utopic right now to speak about this in Mexico. I think people are very Nahuatl to me sounds very sweet, and it's something that should be, all of these languages should be kept, right? They are richness, in they are humanity's history now, right? They are UNESCO, right?
So I'll have to take your word for it.
Anyway, I'm not sure about this, but in any case, they should be kept if possible, right? Alive, and they are alive, and why not? Teach them to everybody. And I think this sounds a little crazy in Mexico. I know you are an American, but you are of Mexican descent, right? So do you have an opinion?
That's what my father tells me.
Your father should be trusted then, for practical reasons at least. So what do you think about this? Do you think this is crazy? I was telling Jorge this. I don't know if Jorge is here. And he was like, oh my God, you are so crazy. But he was very respectful about it. I don't know if the Templeton, for example, could fund this from the outside. I mean, I'm not expecting Mexican politicians to do this. I'm expecting external private organizations.
Yeah, so this gets at a lot of the tricky issues here in the Vasconcelos. So one of the things that I think is part of the why Vasconcelos is such an interesting figure for the people who find him interesting. Other folks find him repellent, but and many of us find him repellent and interesting in equal measure. But I think is partly Vasconcelos is an interesting case of somebody who did make clear efforts at a certain kind of cultural engineering, and a cultural engineering in various ways tied to the history of education systems in Mexico and the expansion of public education systems in Mexico, and very explicitly the attempt to increase the amount of Spanish language education that was going on in indigenous communities, and efforts at translation projects of sort of great works of Western civilization to make them available to inexpensively throughout Mexico. So there's a way in which he's partly an interesting figure because he wasn't all just talk. I mean, he really did try to do things that tried to shape and engineer a certain kind of conception of culture. But I think the flip side of this is exactly the kind of thing that I was talking about in the talk about. I mean, in some sense, I think maybe the single biggest worry for Vasconcelos-style assimilative, integrative, multi-ethnic, multinational, multiracial polity is the problem about what happens to minority groups over time and how to do that. Because one worry is that assimilative pressures end up going the same way assimilative pressures go in economics. So assimilative pressures in economics produce monopolies, and they produce conditions under which you just have, for the purposes of efficiency, we all speak English in academic contexts. And so So one worry is what happens to languages then under that kind of condition, and you can want to and try to take seriously the preservation of languages and the resources that come with the kind of, as it were, built-in ontologies of different languages. But there, I think it's an open question about how to provide the conditions that enable that to happen. And so all of that's to say, I think this is a really complicated issue. I don't know what to make of the issue myself, but I think it gets at both, on the one hand, the tension between the Vasconcelos enthusiasm for diversity, and on the other hand, the assimilative integrative pressure, and what happens under assimilation and integration typically is over time the corrosion of difference as it gets integrated and stabilizes into a recognizable form.
Yeah, but that's not a problem if one recognizes that cultures change inevitably, right? And one agrees to that, and one agrees to make a richer, better culture. That could happen, you know, in the good conditions. So that's
the aspiration. Okay. That's the aspiration.
Paloma?
Thanks for the great talk. I really enjoyed it. My question goes very much on the line of Axel's. I just wanted to get a sense of whether Vasconcelos had a clear idea of what he meant by, or do you have like a view on what he meant by the aesthetic approach? And I say this because, I mean, otherwise, to say that something is aesthetic, it seems that it's intuitive what that means, but that's far from intuitive. I mean, there are all sorts of notions of what the aesthetic means. And I ask you this partly because, well, we need an idea of what aesthetics means in order to see what role it can play in politics. But also because there's, when you told us about the three-stage model, it's very much, I mean, it's suspiciously similar to Schiller's model. I mean, he also had this idea of how the aesthetic had an impact on politics, and he also had like a three-stage model where we had like the savage state, something like that, the intellectual one, and then the aesthetic. But he did have a very clear view of what he meant by aesthetic, and well, it was very much similar to Kant's view of the aesthetic. He had this idea that, you know, the aesthetic approach is one approach that is disinterested, and if you cultivate that disinterested approach, you would see others, without a judgmental approach, and he has a whole view of how he understands this approach, and how, understanding that the aesthetic in that way, we can kind of make sense of how that impacts the political life. So I don't know if Vasconcelos has also an idea of the aesthetic in that.
Yeah, so good. So a couple of different thoughts. So Vasconcelos had a lot to say about aesthetics, wrote an entire book about it, and at least one, maybe several. But I'm the wrong person to answer this question because my sophistication at aesthetics is almost none. But I think you're right to ask that there's a way in which the plausibility of the project is partly going to turn on what an aesthetic politics looks like, and to try to reconstruct that both from the things that he's got these aesthetic themes that he returns to throughout the entirety of his career, and he keeps looping back to it and has different things to say about it at different times. And at least early on, it looks like the story about aesthetics is very similar to the story about disinterest and the possibility of action out of disinterest. And though the three law part, So it's unclear what his full intellectual inheritance is on this, though part of the milieu in which he's coming out is actually Comte. So, and the influence of Comtean positivists in his own education and his own teachers, and the three-stage language there. And when he introduces the law of the law of tastes, he calls it at one point, and then calls it the law of three stages at another point. He actually introduces it with the contrast with Comte. So he says it doesn't have anything to do with Comte. It's got the three, but that doesn't mean he's not getting it from somewhere else, right? So. So the full story about the intellectual inheritance is I'm not at all surprised that it goes through a certain kind of German aesthetic tradition. I think that's got to be where part of the story is going, but it isn't as, I mean, one of the really interesting things about Vasconcelos was that he was himself a massively synthetic thinker. He read super widely and then was busy recombining and rebuilding ideas in different kinds of ways. So that's a project that is needs to get done. My colleague Clinton Tolley is actually trying to work through some of these issues right now and trying to figure out what exactly the aesthetic politics and the aesthetic state look like under Vasconcelos. But that's a project that UC San Diego hasn't finished doing yet.
And I think the problem with Vasconcelos and the politics is a very complicated, because even in Mexico, people are not very happy when you speak about Vasconcelos and politics. And I think
I think I even cite some line by Pereda about Vasconcelos and politics.
But when you put the relation between La Raza Cósmica and the context of the Chicano movement, I think that is a very good form to politicize Vasconcelos. And not only very good, but a very happy form to politicize Vasconcelos. I will say that.
I think everybody else's politics always look happy from the outside. I think it's very
the relationship with the Chicano movement, I think, is a good relationship.
I think it's very complicated. I think it's every bit as complicated as Vasconcelos' relationship internally. So I think this is a much longer conversation, but the short version of it is, I'm not sure that the folks who were invoking Vasconcelos in the Plan de Aztlán and all the various early stages had ever carefully read any of these works. And I mean, because like the entire point of the Vasconcelos political project is that we're not there yet. The question is, we need a utopia, we need a mission, we need a project that will unify us over time, and the Raza Cósmica is a project for the future, that it can grow out of the fact of present mestizaje, but there was nothing in the work that suggests that we've achieved this state yet, that it's a project to be done and a project to be pursued. And in contrast, in the usage in the Chicano movement, the thought was, no. It's happened. We're here, and everything. The line is everything internal and for the race, and everything outside of the race, to hell with it. And that kind of ethno-racial nationalism seems to me at odds with important parts of the actual picture, and led to very complicated politics about the expansion of the Chicano movement in the United States, and what that meant, and how it was structured and organized. So these are all complicated cases, but maybe all of that's just a very fancy way of saying there's no such thing as an uncomplicated politics.
I want to also to say that I found very interesting this twist about the aesthetic eugenetics.
Oh, the aesthetic eugenics.
Because in the last time, a lot of historian of ideas has a lot of suspicion about a very important figure in Latin America, like Sarmiento and even Martí, that there were always with some eugenetic ideas, and I think the idea of an aesthetic eugenesic eliminate all the problems of the eugenism.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that's true. So so I mean, one of the things is if you see
some problems.
I mean, so one of the worries is, and this gets to the two different Vasconceloses. There's the pre-26 Vasconcelos and the post 26 and forward Vasconcelos on this. So the 1925 version and, well, really kind of 1920 to 1925, the aesthetic eugenics, this is where all of the racial stereotype stuff does ugly work in those early pieces, because there it just looks like he suggests that ugly people won't want to have kids anymore, and that blacks won't want to have kids anymore, but white people might have lots of kids because they're very beautiful, and so like that's the sense in which I'm not sure that the racial eugenics that he's preaching in these early pieces is solves anything. It just reproduces the basic problem. But what's interesting is from 26 forward, some of that language drops out, and it doesn't show up in his subsequent work in the same way, at least through 26 through like 1932. And there, in fact, actually you begin to see it merges in various places in Indología, a kind of critique of there's a kind of a critique that begins to leak into the story about the way in which the history of colonization has helped produce a valorization of whiteness that needs to be regarded with caution and suspicion. And that bit is not at all present in the earlier Vasconcelos. So I mean, this is a guy who kept changing his mind about all sorts of things all the time. But I think the aesthetics eugenics idea turns out to be really complicated because, at least in its initial implementation, it looks like it's just a reinscribing of, under a different name, of the problematic eugenics that he had before. Or more accurately, of the problematic eugenics that he claimed to have been resisting. Looks like it reemerges in his conception about what actually happens.
La primera tiene que ver con los puntos que estaban haciendo Guillermo y Carlos acerca de la política. Me parece que el proyecto de Vasconcelos es un proyecto en realidad de nación, o sea, eran un grupo de pensadores que lo que estaban haciendo en ese momento, en los años 20, era pensar esta nación que es la nuestra hoy, ¿no? Y de hecho es muy interesante ver cómo ese proyecto de hecho ha sido en buena medida lo que nuestros gobiernos han implementado de una u otra. Es más complicado que esto, pero tiene que ver, ¿no? Entonces, la primera pregunta que yo tengo es si eso es así, y por eso es que me parece complicado leer a Vasconcelos fuera de contexto y fuera de una lectura política. Si eso es así, entonces pareciera que suscribir este modelo que él tiene para una nueva civilización, cultura, lo que sea, nos compromete con este proyecto de nación. Entonces, por lo menos a mí, ahora aquí en México, me parece complejo asentir y decirte, sí, es una salida interesante para un problema filosófico añejo, profundo, interesante. Yo pondría en cuestión eso en este sentido y quisiera saber qué opinas. Y la segunda pregunta es que, si entendí bien lo que dices, la salida de Vasconcelos para el problema añejo, que no es otro que cosmopolitanismo versus nacionalismo o localismo, es decir, binding, we all bind together, el binding universal, digamos, ¿no? Como los detalles los diste. Pero yo lo que me pregunto es si esa salida, si en general, no te reformula el problema, ¿no? Porque entonces el binding consiste en parte en tomar lo mejor de los distintos y constituir de las distintas culturas locales y constituir una cultura universal, ¿no? Pero entonces, ¿quién decide qué es lo mejor, por un lado? Y por otro lado, si lo que yo considero mejor mío no es incorporado en esta nueva cultura universal, ¿cómo me voy a identificar? ¿Por qué me va a interpelar? Entonces, no sé si esto es el caso o no.
Yeah, great. I'm going to reply in English if that's okay. Yes. Okay. So two things. So I guess on the first part, I think Vasconcelos, he was thinking and working on two different levels at least. I mean, so it's very clear that he was in many ways deeply concerned with the project of the Mexican nation state and post-revolutionary Mexico and how to build a society, and he was deeply concerned about culture and shaping a culture. And I think there's a way in which the post-revolutionary Mexico, I'm not sure that anybody had as much impact as Vasconcelos did over time and in different ways. And so I think there's a way in which there's no story about post-revolutionary Mexico's culture without Vasconcelos in it. It would be an unintelligible story about the history of how that unfolded. For all of that, though, it was still the case that he was deeply and centrally, so far as I can tell, had his eye on a much bigger, more ambitious regional project. And so in that sense, I think, and this is in his writings, and when he's in exile, he's always keeping an ear out about whether or not there's a possibility of some Bolivarismo, trying to bind together these countries, and whether or not there was a kind of real possibility of a pan-Latin American project. And that was a real piece, and in a way that I think there's oftentimes a certain kind of friction with his de facto Mexican nationalism, and that they're oftentimes in tension with each other in different places about where's the energy and so on. And I do think, there's a reading of Vasconcelos that goes something like, well, look, you always have to do your politics from a specific place and in the particular conditions under which you're finding yourself. And so if you can direct Mexican culture in a way that takes seriously the idea of race mixing and gets people to sign on board for the idea that what it is to be Mexican is to be of mixed race and to be of a culture that can synthesize diverse things, that this is a first step towards helping to move a larger community over time in that direction. So I think that was part of how he happened to, in fact, be thinking about it. Okay, but what about, so suppose now we're thinking about this utopic state. What is the utopic state going to be like? Here I think the aesthetic state, at least from the as best as I can reconstruct from the story, Vasconcelos doesn't think it, so he's very explicit that it's not imperialistic and it won't preclude or doesn't require the erasure of other communities and other races. So I think his thought is going to be, yeah, there might be other folks who continue to be interested in purity. Other nation states are going to persist in their own ways, but this is going to be a community that people will want to come on board in. And now we can ask questions about the relativism of judgments about cultural excellence and not, but I think Vasconcelos has the following the following idea in his back pocket that he gets to wield, which is that one challenge for aesthetic excellence is the achievement of integrating more diversity rather than less. And so there's always going to be an open-ended interest in trying to pull in diversity and to suss out whether or not it can be harmonized or integrated. And so there are going to be folks who might look at the Comunidad Cósmica and think, no, they're not doing my culture in the right way. But I think he thinks, here's this interesting thing that should arise out of a group that, if it were to be able to look at cultural achievements without bias in the same way in which they sense, I think he thinks, one of the things that's going on right now is everybody sees through racially biased eyes. And so he thinks, when he's writing this in 1925, that everybody's seeing these through lenses of their own civilizational authorities. And part of the trick is, can we get people past that? Well, he thinks maybe the way you get people past that is by getting people to sign on board for this process of race mixing than aesthetic integration. And if you can do that, then you might think he gets to say the following kind of thing. Look, we don't yet have societies that look impartially at what's beautiful and joy-inducing and genuinely human excellence, because we're all heavily committed to all these things that are biasing our own estimations of these things. So what would it look like to have genuine, disinterested, open-ended, to the full human diversity kinds of judgments? Well, they're not the kind of judgments we're making right now. They would have to be judgments that we'd be making in a very different kind of situation. And I think that's the thing he's going to wield against somebody who says, yeah, but you don't get it the way I do. And then he says, yeah, but ours are biased eyes right now.
I'm concerned that as far as dealing with, I think, one of the most pressing issues at the moment that the Vasconcelos project could be misleading with respect to what I think is the right diagnosis of what we're looking at the moment. Now, I mean, to a certain extent, the aesthetic utopia, the aesthetic nation, is a kind of a return to something like the ideals of Herder and Goethe.
Yeah.
But what intervenes is the rise of racialism, beginning with Francis Galton, beginning with eugenics, and going and clearly Vasconcelos was bathed in that environment. Now, it seems to me that there's good reason to think that a certain kind of tribalism is always part of the human story. That aspect of the anthropology is right. I think that's completely wrong when it comes to racialism, and that Vasconcelos was taken in to a certain extent by his time. I mean, there's nothing new about tribalism, but racialism is a fairly new story. Now, it seems to me that if we are looking at, let's say, the present danger, I mean, we are facing a kind of fledgling, or more than fledgling, white nationalist, international white nationalist fascist movement. There's a very good piece in the New York Times the other day, if people didn't see it, laying out the basis of the international aspect of what could otherwise look like a purely American phenomena. The rhetoric, the psychology, the strategies, and so on are very much international at this point. Now, it seems to me that one doesn't understand what's going on in that respect without seeing that the progenitors of these people has to do with being feeling left out. That these are not the champions, these are not the victors, these are the losers. These are people who are experiencing themselves as being, I mean, so in other words, we have to see it, I think, in the context of things like the increasing disparity of wealth, nationally and internationally, and the fact that you have this non-urban white population in Europe and in the U.S. and who feels left out. Now, part of what I'm trying to get at is that it seems to me that the image of a kind of multi-ethnic utopianism, a cultural renaissance, a multicultural Goethean kind of renaissance, is exactly what they feel left out of, and not for no reason. They really are left out. They not only don't they live in cities, they can't afford to live in cities. Right? So it seems to me that if we take the rhetoric, the white racial nationalist rhetoric at face value, it's misleading. I think that psychologically a strong motivation is envy. Is the fact that they're not being celebrated the way Black culture is celebrated, the way Latino culture is celebrated, the way multicultural milieu is on the marquee. And so what happens is that this ideology, which is international and propagated on the internet, becomes a kind of an attractant. Right? I think it would be a mistake to treat it as having anything to do with biological roots, or it's not about tribalism. It's pan-tribal. It's really a very pernicious and a very dangerous ideology. But I think it has to be understood in a global socioeconomic context.
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot there, and I'm not going to be able to address all of it, but I guess 2 points here. So one is that I, of course, don't think that Vasconcelos is anything like a panacea here. I mean, that is, I don't think the kinds of very live and real problems that we've got with nationalisms of various sorts, and I don't think it's just one variety. I think there are multiple kinds of nationalisms running around out there. But there's no silver bullet here, and I do think that. But I do think that Vasconcelos has some interesting tools for thinking about part of what's going on in these kinds of contexts, and the reason why I guess so I think. That one of the things I think is interesting about the way in which cultural nationalism has currently configured is that it's I think it's interesting that it seems to, so far as my understanding is from political science colleagues, it has less to do with economics than people initially thought, and more to do with a fear of not just population replacement, but cultural displacement, displacement of cultural authority. And I think one of the interesting things about the Vasconcelos kind of style of story is one that goes something like, in some sense, the lesson for everybody is, look, if you ever enjoyed cultural authority, it was always temporary. And but the next best thing, given that none of us can enjoy permanent cultural authority, is going to be to play a role in the construction of culture, where we are contributors of and get to enjoy. But that's an alternative vision about how it goes together, and I don't think just articulating that automatically solves the cultural nationalism problem, because of course it doesn't, because people have wants and desires and needs and self-conceptions and so on that I think you're right to think of certain kinds of nationalism serve as attractor positions. But I think this is the beginning of expanding our toolkit, because I think one of the things that has become very clear is that if there's going to be anything like a satisfactory response to white nationalism, that it's going to have to go by way of expansion of the toolkit that we use for thinking and talking about these things.
Expansion
of our toolkit for thinking and talking about these things, because I think it's clear to me in conversation with the typical educated good liberal friend that is not hearing the worries that are propelling that's propelling at least some varieties of popular nationalisms, and it's the fact of the difficulty of hearing what's propelling that and being able to articulate responses that are moving people that I think is part of what makes the threat that arises out of popular nationalism as powerful a threat as it is. And I don't think, these things are always super complicated and multi-directional about how directions of influence go and whose responsibility it is to meet with what, and how population shifts adjust these kinds of things. So that's all granted. But I do think we do need to expand our toolkit, and that's what I think Vasconcelos gives us, at least some expansion of the toolkit.
Muchas gracias a Manuel. Nos vemos el miércoles.